Welcome to this YSL tutorial on how to use the TRIMRANGE function in Microsoft Excel. This video is all about how to refer to trimmed ranges in your Excel formulas. We'll kick off with a quick recap of using basic dynamic array formulas, and then explain how to use the TRIMRANGE function to allow you to reference empty cells in the formula without producing answers for those cells. We'll show you how to use the function to trim both rows and columns, and then towards the end of the video, how to employ the shorthand trim ref notation to have the same effect with much less code. So let's get started. If you've watched some of the other videos in this series, you'll be familiar with the concept of dynamic spilled arrays at this point, which basically allow you to create one single formula in an Excel cell that produces multiple answers which spill out into the neighbouring cells. Just by way of a quick example of that, I've got here a list of the top 15 Oscar-winning films of all time. And what I'd like to do is work out the profit for each film by subtracting the budget value from the box office. The traditional, conventional, old-fashioned way of doing this would be to write a single formula there in cell H3, and then copy that formula down the list to replicate it for each row. But with a spilled array, my life is a little bit easier. So heading to cell H3, I can write a formula that references not just one single box office value, but the entire list, and then subtract from that the full list of all the budgets, so that when I press enter to commit the formula, it produces 15 different results which spill out into the neighbouring cells. So that's quite a handy thing to be able to do, but it does have one quite big limitation. If I head to the end of column F and G and start filling in some more sample data, you can see that my formula doesn't automatically expand downwards to take that into account. Now there are some techniques I could use without involving dynamic arrays to get around this, but that would kind of defeat the point of this video. So I'd like to continue with my dynamic array formula, but have it automatically expand downwards as new data gets added to my list. One fairly basic way to make this happen is just to refer to more cells in your initial formula than you really need to. So you sort of anticipate that more cells will be filled in later. So let's just recreate the formula in cell H3. I'm going to delete it entirely and then recreate it by referring not just to the populated cells in column G, but if that's completely overboard, I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of the worksheet. So I'm using the keyboard shortcut Control-Shift down arrow to do that. Then I can subtract from that range of cells the corresponding rows in column F, and then hit enter to get way more answers than I really want at this point. I've got all the populated answers where the rows are populated with the real data, and then zeros on all the remaining rows. Those zeros will of course update when I fill in new data in the columns F and G, of course, but it's not really ideal seeing all these zeros initially. So we kind of want some sort of intermediate solution that allows us to refer to an expanded range of cells, but only display answers when those cells are populated with values. And that's where the TRIMRANGE function comes in. So to use the TRIMRANGE function, I'm going to head back to the formula in cell H3 and then edit that and wrap a TRIMRANGE function around each of the individual cell references we've used in this formula. So equals TRIMRANGE, and then open up some round brackets. You can hopefully see here from the tooltip there are 3 parameters in total: range, row trim mode, and col trim mode, but only the range parameter is compulsory, so that's the only one we're going to provide a value to at this point. So I just need to close the round brackets after my first cell reference, and then repeat that for the second cell reference, so minus TRIMRANGE, and then F3 to F1,048,576. Close the round brackets at the end, and then hit enter. And at that point, we'll see all those rogue zeros disappear. The great thing about the TRIMRANGE function is essentially it looks at the full range of cells you've provided as its argument, and then stops referencing those cells when it hits empty ones. So if I start filling in new data at the end of my list, the formula will respond. I need to make sure there's a value in each column, of course, otherwise the formula won't work properly, but there we go. It works equally well backwards. If I start taking values away from the columns, then the TRIMRANGE function trims again. One thing to watch out for is if you do leave a gap and put in some more information, then you'll get those rogue zeros again. So the range expands down to essentially the last populated cell in the columns you're referencing. But it's a dramatic improvement on the solution we had before without using the TRIMRANGE function. Just to quickly explain these optional parameters of the trim range function, I'm going to head back to the formula in cell H3, edit that, click inside the first trim range function there and type in a comma to get to this row trim mode parameter. So this basically lets us control exactly which cells are trimmed from the range you've referenced. You can see there are 4 options here. So the first option there, numbered 0, would be to trim no rows. It kind of begs the question why that exists. If I didn't want to trim any rows, I wouldn't be using a function called TRIMRANGE in the first place. But there we are, it exists. Feel free to use it if you want to. Then you've got options to trim leading or trailing rows. So this is whether you anticipate blank rows at the beginning of the range or at the end of the range. And then the final option there, option number 3, which is the default, is to trim both leading and trailing. In this particular example, because I don't anticipate any blank cells at the beginning of the range I've referenced, we could get away with option number 2, to trim only the trailing rows. I could do the same thing there for the second trim range function, use option number 2 for trailing, and then enter that formula and see exactly the same end results. The third parameter there, just to quickly explain the col trim mode, is to do with whether you've referenced multiple columns and expect to see blank cells at the right-hand side or the left-hand side. As we've only referenced one single column here, that parameter is irrelevant for us. The col trim mode parameter could come in handy if your data is arranged a bit more horizontally than vertically, like for instance over here on this cash flow worksheet, which is a very rudimentary cash flow system for an imaginary chocolate shop called Coco Chanel. First of all, I'd like to perform a calculation that adds up the materials, labour and overheads costs for each month, but only showing an answer for completed months. I don't want to see zeros for any columns that don't yet have any data in them. So once again, the trim range function can come in handy here. So in cell F15, I'm going to say equals trim range, and then refer first of all to the cells in row number 6, so F6 to Q6. I'm not anticipating adding any more columns to this worksheet. I'm going to have a fixed 12-period forecast for this particular model. If I then close the round brackets and say plus, and then another trim range function for my labour costs, and then another plus and another trim range function for my overheads costs. And again, I appreciate that without using dynamic arrays, there may well be much more efficient ways to do this, but again, that would defeat the point of this video, so let's stick with it. So if I hit enter at that point, I'll see I get my total costs for the first 3 months that are complete. And if I just really quickly fill in the same values across to month number 4, I'll just highlight those 3 cells and press Ctrl R to fill right. We'll see the formula expands automatically again. So again, the optional parameter of col trim range would allow us to control more precisely exactly which cells get trimmed from the ranges we've specified. So heading back to the formula in cell F15, I can edit that, type in a couple of commas to get to the col trim mode parameter. And once again, the options are the same. So again, in this case, I'd be trimming the trailing columns. So trailing columns are the ones at the right-hand side of the range you've specified, leading at the left-hand side. So it will make no difference in the final result here, but just to quickly demonstrate, I could use the trailing option for all 3 trim range functions here and still get the same end result from this formula. Just to finish off this example, then we could create another formula to work out the revenue generated for each month, again involving another trim range function. So here we could say equals, and then cell E11, so the average spend we expect each customer to make, and then multiply that by trim range, and then all of the number of sales figures, the ones we filled in and the ones yet to be completed. So once we've done that and hit enter, we can once again see if we fill in new data, then we get new answers filled in automatically as we go along. The final formula in this example would be just to take the costs and add the revenue, which is quite nice and easy to do when we've got dynamic arrays. You can see when you're working with dynamic arrays, as we pointed out in previous videos, when you select a cell in it, you get a little thin blue outline around the entire range. So the really simple thing we can do here in cell F17 is simply say equals cell F15, and then the notation that allows you to reference the dynamic array that that cell belongs to simply add a hash symbol to the end of the cell reference, and you can see that it's automatically highlighted the entire dynamic array. I can then say plus F16 and use the hashtag notation again, then hit enter, and we will then see when we fill in new values, even without using the TRIMRANGE function in this final calculation, then we get new answers populating automatically as the dynamic array grows. The hash notation expands to keep track of it. So quite an efficient way to build up that sort of calculation without seeing all these rogue answers that you don't yet want to see. Now, on the subject of using special notation to reference cells differently in Excel, here we're using the hash symbol to reference an entire dynamic array, for example. Along with the TRIMRANGE function, Microsoft also introduced something called the TRIMREF notation. This is a way to basically employ the same effects of the TRIMRANGE function without having to write TRIMRANGE in your formulas. Just to demonstrate how that works, I'm going to head back to my top 15 winners worksheet and back to the initial formula we created in cell H3. I'm going to zoom in a bit here as well to make it a bit easier to see what's going on. If I edit this formula, I'm going to first of all take away the TRIMRANGE function altogether from around the cells in column G. The TRIMRANGE notation, the TRIMREF notation, I should say, allows you to write a full stop or a period or a dot either side of the colon, which separates the two cells in the range you're referring to. So if I say G3 dot colon dot, that will trim both leading and trailing cells from that range. For this particular example, because I again don't anticipate having any blank cells at the beginning of the range, I could say G3 colon dot G 1 million, etc. And I can do the exact same thing then for the second cell reference. So rather than TRIMRANGE F3 to F 1 million, etc., I can say F3 colon dot, and that would trim blank cells at the end of that range. So that's going to have the exact same effect as using the TRIMRANGE function in this formula. If I commit to that now, we'll see we get the same answers, and we'll see those answers grow as we add more data to the end of our list and disappear when we remove values from the end of the list. So the effect is identical. It just makes your formulae that bit shorter. It's a bit less messy, I think. The downside of that is it's a little bit less transparent. Somebody reading that formula would have to understand the importance of those dots in the middle of your cell references, but at least you have the choice. Use whichever technique works best for you. So now that you've seen the TRIMRANGE function and TRIMREF notation, you can start to employ those techniques in much more complex formulas. For the next example, I'd like to use a lookup system to return a description for each of my films based on its runtime in minutes. Let's add a new column to column I. I'm going to call this one length. And then I've already created my lookup table here on the lookup tables worksheet. It's quite a short list of 3 threshold values and the description to apply to a film if it hits that threshold in terms of its runtime minutes. To add the formula then, let's head into cell I3 on the top 15 winners worksheet, and let's use an XLOOKUP function. Let's get away from old-fashioned VLOOKUPs here. Let's employ the more modern dynamic array versions of these functions. So the lookup value, I want to refer to the film's runtimes. And again, rather than just referring to the populated cells, to ensure that the answers will continue to be added to my list afterwards, I'm going to refer to the entirety of column C, but then use this special TRIMREF notation, so C3 colon dot C 1 million, etc. Then I'm going to type in a comma and then refer to my lookup array. Now my lookup array is in my lookup tables worksheet, and I very deliberately created this table so that the very first value is on the first row of the worksheet. There are no column headers here at all, and that's to allow me to simply reference the entirety of column A. I don't need to include any cell references, any row numbers here at all, just the whole of column A. But I want to make sure I only reference the populated cells. So again, using this TRIMREF notation, I can type in a full stop after the colon, then a comma at the end of that, and get the return array, which again, very simply, I can select column B and then use the TRIMREF notation to reference only the populated cells. And then a couple of extra optional parameters. The if not found parameter. If I can't find a match for what I'm looking up, I'm going to display a blank empty cell using an empty string, double quotes, with nothing in between. The final thing we'll do, and quite importantly here for the way this lookup function works, xlookup always looks for an exact match by default. And that's not going to return many results for me. If I look for each of my film runtimes in this very short list of 3 numbers here, there won't be many, if any, exact matches. So I'm going to use option -1, find an exact match, or the next smaller item. That's more like the default behavior of the VLOOKUP function, if you know that. So if I close the round brackets there and hit enter, we should see when we return to this worksheet, our list of descriptions has been filled in. And it will equally well expand if I start typing in more values at the end of the list. I'll get more answers as usual. What's great about this though is I've also got the ability to increase the range of my lookup array and return array simply by heading to the lookup tables worksheet. And let's add in a couple of extra categories here. I'm going to add a threshold of 200 and make that an epic film. And let's say 250, and that's a snooze fest, way too long. I don't need to change anything else because of the trimref notation I've used in my formula. If I head back to the original worksheet, I've now automatically got some epic films and some snooze fest films with no extra changes required whatsoever. For the final example in this video, I'm going to write a system that's going to let us return a filtered list of films from this worksheet. So to get started with that, I'm going to tidy up and get rid of these extra rows at the bottom. And then let's create a brand new worksheet in the workbook. And step number 1, I want to return all of the column headers from the top 15 winners sheet, but only the cells that are populated. So in cell A1, I'm going to say equals, and then simply reference row number 2 of the top 15 winners sheet. But of course, I don't want to reference and return values from all these empty cells, so let's use that trimref notation there, add a full stop after the colon, hit enter, and then we've got our column headers. The important thing is the dynamic array stops when it runs out of values to return. It's a bit of a shame about the formatting there. It would be nice if we could format only the populated cells in that row. So a quick little bit of conditional formatting can help with this. If we highlight the entire row number 1, then head to conditional formatting, various ways to do this. I'm going to create a new rule and then choose format only cells that contain a cell value that is not equal to, and then I need to insert essentially an empty string into this box. I'm going to say equals and then double quotes. It's difficult to see that, unfortunately. It was a bit blurry, but that's equals speech marks. And then I can go to the format button and set a fill color, for instance. Maybe head to the font tab, make the font bold, and then make the font color white as well. So if I hit OK, we should now find that only the populated cells are formatted in that list there. Next, I want to return a filtered list of films from the original sheet. So I'm going to use the filter function to do that. So equals filter. And the first thing I need to do is specify the array of cells that I'm filtering. So I'm going to head back to my top 15 winners sheet, start by selecting cell A3. And then I want to basically deal with the fact that I might add many extra rows, but also many extra columns to this list. So I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and tap the down arrow key a couple of times, and then tap the right arrow key a couple of times as well, to essentially select all the cells on the worksheet from row number 3 downwards. I want to make sure that I only reference the currently populated cells, of course. So once again, that trimref notation, so 3: dot. Okay, so that is the array of cells I want to filter. If I then type in a comma, I'm going to return to the top of the worksheet. And let's say which of these columns do we want to apply a filter to. Let's go for the years. I'm going to select cell B3, and then again head all the way down to the bottom of the worksheet using trimref notation to only reference the populated cells. And then let's say we only want to see films that have been released since 1990, so greater than or equal to 1990, for instance. If I then close the round brackets and hit enter, we'll return to our extra worksheet with all the matching results. The great thing about this, of course, is that it's going to respond now if we add any additional rows to our worksheet, of course. So what extra films could we add? I guess Predator would have been a good one. That certainly should have been in the top 15 Oscar-winning films of all time. Sadly, it wasn't. Oh, it wasn't released from 1990 onwards. Let's pretend it was released in 1995, just for the example. And then, yeah, good. So that film will have been returned as well to sheet number 7. So there it is. But it will also respond if we add new columns as well. We could add in, say, a review column in the original worksheet. Let's add a review. And then Titanic, let's call that soggy. Lord of the Rings is epic in every sense of the word, not just its length. And then Predator, of course, the greatest story ever told. So once we've filled all that in, and I'll spell words correctly eventually, once we've done all this, return to the extra worksheet. The extra columns being added in there as well in both the title row and the results returned by the filter function. So there we go, a fairly comprehensive look at how to use trim range and trim ref notation to make your formulae that little bit more dynamic in Excel. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.